Well, as Ruth observed a few moments ago, winter held on to the last moment. Just, was it 10 days ago? There were still flakes. I was at the gym, and I looked out the window, and there were snowflakes coming down. And I said it with a kind of horrible disappointment in nature. And then a few days later, suddenly it was 80 degrees. And I needed a fan to cool off my bedroom just that fast. We think of time, and especially time in nature, as kind of moving geologically. We can't see a tree grow. We don't remember or notice that the Grand Canyon is actually getting grander every day because the Colorado keeps digging it deeper. But sometimes it happens overnight. Like the trees on my block that suddenly went from dead to pink in like 24 hours. And the next day, all their blossoms are falling off. And I'm saying, please don't go so fast. In fact, I'm running over blossoms with my car and thinking, too soon, too soon. Too slow, too fast. That's how time seems to travel for us, doesn't it? May these words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be found true in thy sight, thou who art my rock and my Redeemer. And may they be too fast for those who are bored and too slow for those who need them. Up in what is now Columbia State Park in the state of California, in 1862, during the American Civil War, there were Mexican workers. They were not illegal immigrants. They had been there since before Mexico ceded it to the United States. And they heard news. General Zaragoza and his vastly outnumbered Mexican army had defeated the imperial French forces of Napoleon III that had landed recently to impose themselves on the Mexican people. They met at the city of Puebla, a colonial city of some beauty, within sight of a volcano that still smolders to this day, called by the Aztec name Popocatépetl. I just like saying the name. Isn't it a beautiful name, Popocatépetl? It's a beautiful volcano, and it hovers over the horizon with that, don't get too comfy look on its. Mexican forces eventually were defeated by the French, and they installed the Emperor Maximilian I on the throne of Mexico. But that battle, that one victory, took place on the 5th of May in 1862. And those Mexicanos in Mexico celebrated. And they did it the next year, and the year after that, and the year after that. Yes, it was the very first observance of Cinco de Mayo. And why does it matter to West Michigan gringos and gringas? Well, for one, you might have thought it's what Mexicans did in Mexico, but it wasn't. It was Mexicanos living in what was, by that point, the United States. And that means that Cinco de Mayo is an American holiday, celebrated by Mexicanos and Mexicanas. Reminding us also that Mexicanos and Mexicanas have been in our country since the beginning of our, before the beginning of our country. What we may not remember is that the famous Texas Revolution, Alamos and all that stuff, were popular. The revolutionaries were not just white Americans who had come to Texas. Some of them were Tejanos and Tejanas who had been there for 200 years, throwing off the yoke of Santa Anna, not because he was Mexican, but because he was a dictator. We don't remember that part. We don't remember, because we mispronounce them, that there were great American cities established well before a white man ever got there. San Antonio de Bejar, which is in Texas now, established in 1691. That seems to be a little earlier than Sam Houston got there. How many of you, I'm looking at you, Crandall, how many Fountain Streeters spend time in Tucson, Arizona? It's founded by Mexicanos in 1775. San Francisco, you know that's Mexican. Did you know it was founded by Mexicanos in 1776? Anyone here besides me remember watching episodes of The Legend of Zorro? Ah, the laughter of recognition. Do you remember where it was set? In El Pueblo de Nuestra Señora, la Reina de Los Ángeles, in Mexican Los Angeles, which was settled in 1760-something. The number I can't remember off the top of my head. The states of Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada, and California were all Mexico until they were ceded by the country of Mexico after the U.S. invaded them, like the French did 20 years earlier, and wouldn't leave until they got the land. In other words, a third of what we call the United States of America was part of the United States of Mexico, and before that it was part of the colonial empire of Spain, and many of those Spanish colonies were just as settled as any Massachusetts, New York, or New Jersey. But we don't remember that part. We see Mexicanos and think they've come up from some other place when they have been everywhere all the time. But let's go beyond the obvious. I'm not here just to give a political disquisition on the injustice gringos and other whites have leveled at people of Mexican origin. There is something deeper, something spiritual, something moral at stake. And we start with the irony that Cinco de Mayo was an American observance of a Mexican event. And that even today, you'll find more events around Cinco de Mayo in Michigan, Massachusetts, New York, and California, and Texas than you will find in Mexico, where it is not a holiday except in the state of Puebla where it took place. Oh, there will be holidays and observances elsewhere. Do you remember when we had the unfortunate bombing of the Boston Marathon, which took place on what is called Patriots' Day in Massachusetts? But it's only Patriots' Day there because that's where it happened. It's the same way in Mexico. Cinco de Mayo is a local holiday that is known by other Mexicanos, but not observed as widely there as it is here in the United States. So there's something more than nationalism going on. And now I'm going to veer away from this story so I can grab another story to show you how this all fits in. I don't know how many of you are pedestrians around town, but you need to be kind of a pedestrian to notice the signs on our local buses. You ever notice the signs on the buses? Okay, good. See, fellow pedestrians, you get that. I know you. Well, one of the signs that's on one of the buses now says, on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks sat down so we could stand up for justice. It's a great observance. It has nothing to do with Cinco de Mayo yet, but I'm going to get there. Now, you know that story, at least part of it. Rosa Parks was a domestic worker in one part of Montgomery going home for the evening and was on a bus going home. Now, in Montgomery, Alabama at the time, the white section was in the front and the black section was in back, but the borderline, the row itself could vary, meaning that when more whites got on, the driver could literally move the dividing line back and make the blacks stand up if there were many of them so that all the whites would have a place. And I tell you this because when Rosa Parks got on the bus, she didn't sit in the white section, she sat in the black section. But as the bus began to fill up, the driver stopped, moved the dividing line back a row and a half or two, and suddenly she was in the white section and he instructed her to move. And that's when she refused. And she was arrested. And the Montgomery Improvement Association, the group of black pastors and leaders, called the boycott. And when the boycott went on for a year, eventually the Montgomery bus system yielded, not to them, I should point out, but to a federal court that told them it was illegal to do it. And after that, people started riding on buses everywhere, and they called them freedom riders, and some of those buses were literally blown up. In other words, Rosa Parks sat down, refused to get up, and the civil rights movement stood up from that day forward. There's much more, of course, but the symbolic act of sitting down on principle has a word attached to it that has everything to do with Cinco de Mayo, has everything to do with us. The word is dignity. We like to talk about dignity a lot. We don't really think about it often. We should probably ponder it a little. Now, if you want to go study it, I commend two great authors to you. Pico della Mirandola, a Renaissance Italian who wrote a great piece called An Oration on the Dignity of Man, the beginning of the Renaissance. He spoke up and changed the world. And Immanuel Kant, famously dense, boring, tedious, but if you want to read about dignity and become an expert, go there. For this essay, this sermon, let me just say this much about dignity. It is, as everyone agrees, Mirandola, Kant, and others, the respect owed someone by virtue of their existence alone. It is innate. It's what you get for being on the planet. And it is inalienable. You cannot give it away. But sadly, it can be taken. Now, I've got to tell you a little bit about the scripture readings today because they bear upon the notion of dignity. One I didn't share today is from Leviticus. It's at the end of the book. In fact, it was read in synagogues yesterday, and it is an odd passage in which they say how much a person is worth in silver when paying dues to the temple. It's very exotic. 50 shekels for this person, 30 for that, all based on their economic value. So young men of 20 up to men of 60 would be worth 50 shekels. Next year, I'll only be worth 20 shekels. I will be 61. Women are worth less because they produce less. And you think, how crass, how mercantile to value people in shekels, how antique, how out of touch with modernity. The variance between an able-bodied Israelite gentleman of capacity and an infant is the difference between 50 shekels and 6 shekels. Smallest, largest. Now, ask me, how much does the CEO of General Motors make compared to a line worker in a plant? Is it more than 10 to 1? Whose culture is more inequitable at that measurement? Whose is more understanding of dignity and worth? So even ancient peoples understood there could be variances in merchant value, but you couldn't go too far or you would threaten to break the strand of dignity that exists, that holds the whole community together. The law was to prevent inflation of one's value and deflation of another. No child was worth less than 3 shekels, no matter how sickly. No rich man was worth more than 50 shekels, no matter how rich. Now look at our own economy and ask, who had more dignity?